Um, yeah, so just like some things that we're gonna continue doing this mod, the class surveys we're gonna do, but we're gonna do them slightly different format. Um, at a high level, like these class surveys, I think have been really good for us to get feedback. Like Brian and I really enjoyed it, and it helps us kind of like look back on classes, and it helps us understand like pace really well. And the whole point is like lightest lift for y'all, right? Like if you want to give us written feedback, you can, but if you just want to click like how engaged you were or not, that's still helpful for us. The way that we're going to do it this time is we're going to have Ian's going to have a survey and I'm going to have a survey, and then for each class it's going to be the same sheet for each class, but there'll be a drop down where you select what class you're giving the feedback from, and then that will help us like keep one Google sheet to like one Google sheet that we can track basically throughout the mod. And now that I'm saying it, I might change it back to where like Ian and I are just on the same sheet. I don't know. We'll talk about that. We'll see. Um, but the whole point is like, so you have one sheet that's going to be on. I'm gonna like link them on the due date tracker, and the due date tracker I'll have to y'all like sometime today. And yeah, I think, and also we're giving you an optional name column. So if you want the feedback to remain anonymous, totally fine. If you want your feedback to be like tracked to you, that's great too. We're not gonna like hold that against you in any way. It's just like it would be interesting for us to see like, hey, where like what did you say as the mod went on, and like how did your feedback change throughout the mod. And I think like just with feedback in general in these surveys, like there's a lot of like powerful things we could do that we're not doing, so I think like this is like a step in that direction. And then yeah, I think like Ian and I were talking yesterday, and one of the things we want to emphasize is just speak up early and often if you have feedback for us. If you need something in your learning that you're not getting, we want to hear from you. And the worst thing you could do is stay silent until like week 5 or 6, and then kind of like drop a bomb that like things are horrible for you, and we haven't been serving you. So just tell us upfront what's going on with you, and we will be happy to address it.
Yeah, and for me, the whole idea of making your name optional is if you want to be anonymous when you give us that feedback, totally cool with that, as long as we can get some kind of feedback. If you want to put your name on it because you want to let us know that you struggled in a particular way, then we can get you more help on that topic. And if we see like, hey, a whole bunch of folks like actually had a problem with that class, we'll revisit that class. You know, preferably within the same inning with the same cohort so that we can like reinforce that learning and not say, well, we'll just do it better next time for the next group of people. We want to make sure that all of you are getting the content. And so if we start to see those trends like, oh, that class didn't go well, like maybe we'll do like a refresher on it or something, or maybe we thought it was going to be more review, but it turned out like it wasn't so much review that we needed to teach more of the fundamentals. Um, so yeah, we're looking for like, wish that class was a little faster, wish it was a little slower. There's also reaction stuff in Zoom that you can use as well, for like go slower, go faster, and I'll like try and pay attention to those too. So if you feel like things are going a little slow, just flag that for me. I'll kind of watch those come in. Those reactions don't stay on the participant panel for very long. But I will try and pay attention to those. We'll definitely take palm breaks. The class this morning is slotted for 3 hours. I don't think we're going to need 3 hours. So I will give you some time back. And I want to kind of pose a question to all of you. If we can get through this in say 2 hours, we can move that database planning class from 1 p.m. to like 11, and then you can have the whole afternoon for project time. So we'll kind of see how the morning goes as we kind of get through the idea of authentication. We're going to be building out a couple of controllers and a couple of forms just to do a really simple user registration and a user login. So we're going to be making like a user's controller and a welcome controller. I'm basically starting a Rails app from scratch here. And so some of it will feel a little bit like review from mod 2. That's on purpose, just to kind of get you back into the idea of like, oh yeah, I got to build a controller and it's got to be named a certain way and where to put it. And so I'm not going to be spending a like time going, well, this is where we need to put our file and this is what we need to call it. I'm just going to be like, I'm making a user's controller. And I presume that all of you know where to do that, what to call it. But if you do need me to slow down, like feel free to like wave in the reaction thing, tell me to slow down, all that kind of stuff along the way. So it's not meant to like review a lot of mod 2 stuff, but we're kind of going back to the very beginning of like, let's start with the test. Let's test drive out what we're going to try to build. And we're going to go through and we're going to build a user registration where we're just going to take in like an email address and a password, and then we're going to have a login page for the same. Any questions on that so far? Sydney, what do you got?
Just so I'm understanding, we're going to build this app from scratch, right? There's nothing to clone down.
There's nothing to clone right now, but at the end of the class, I'll push up what I've made. And then that will be kind of like if you want to like pull that down and practice that, you will be able to.
Okay, cool.
Cool. And then, yeah, in subsequent classes, like when Tim does sessions and cookies tomorrow, he'll be building off of this same repo. And at that point, we're just going to branch off of everything and kind of build things as we go. Cool. All right. Well, let's jump in. So the whole idea of authentication is, who are you? It's kind of the big thing, really. If like there are a lot of cool websites out there where you can consume some things and you can be anonymous about it. You don't have to say who you are. You're consuming that information. The thing with consuming information off a web page is you're using somebody's resources. You're making them pay for a server somewhere. You're using their internet bandwidth, which they're also typically paying for. And so you're kind of costing them money. I mean, even if it's like fractions of pennies, that can add up if you're a really busy site. And so they want you to register so that they can like advertise to you or maybe sell your data to someone else to like make money to help pay for their own system resources. So the idea of authenticating is we want to do something with their data. Now, a lot of times we're really just, hey, I want you to authenticate so I can track something for you and be even more useful to you. When we build out websites, like in the consultancy project, for example, we'll typically say, hey, show them give them something for free. And by free, I mean, they don't have to register. So like the Get the Flight Out project, for example, that's in DemoComp tonight, I encourage them like, hey, let them do like one flight search for free, where they don't have to register. They can just go in and say like, find me a random flight. But if they actually register and log in, then they can get like a whole bunch of search results and they can do a whole lot more on the site. And a lot of other sites will do kind of the same thing. You can consume a little bit of the site without authentication, but once you do authenticate, it opens up a lot more. And so the idea that we're going to cover here is just, who are you? That's really all we're going to track. And so as far as learning goals, we're going to get into just reviewing migrations, model testing, feature testing, just building out simple controllers, nothing very advanced right now. We're going to get into how to model this kind of stuff and a couple of gotchas around handling user authentication. And we'll cover that kind of as we go. And I'm hoping this isn't going to take like the whole morning for us. We will talk very briefly about flash messages and how we're going to show that on the screen. I know you already did that on mod 2 as well. And so some of this is just kind of picking up over the last 2 innings. Basically, Tim and Brian in mod 2 were working with Dion and I in mod 3 to try to figure out how are we going to like swap some lessons where more of the API consumption stuff has now moved down into mod 2 and the authentication stuff from mod 2 is now moved up into mod 3. Some of this is like learning curve a little bit for us of like, what do you know? Oh, you didn't learn that part yet. Oh, you already knew that part already. So that's why I'm saying like, feel free to just tell me to like skip this part or like speed up, slow down as we go. All right, so as far as vocabulary goes, authentication, we're going to talk about hashing methods. We talk about the hash as a data structure, but the hash actually got its name through like a mathematical formula, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. We are not going to get into helper methods. I need to take that out of the notes. And we're going to talk about using bcrypt, which is an encryption tool which will encrypt passwords in a way that they can't be reversed or not in any practical amount of time to be detrimental. Alrighty, so the whole idea of authentication, going back again to who are you? And this is really like, who are you and how do I verify that? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna start with a user story. And with that user story, we're just gonna say, hey, when I visit kind of the home page, I wanna see a link that says sign up. And if I click on that, I fill out a registration form. And with that registration form, then I'm gonna fill in like a username or an email address. I'm gonna give you a password. You're gonna save that in the database. And then I'm gonna see a message saying that I'm logged in. So that's where we're going to get started. I'm going to share my screen. So go over here and I'm going to share this whole screen. Please let me know if the font size is okay. We will be getting into like a fair amount of code. I'll be running stuff in the terminal, so I'll make sure that like my terminal font is also bigger. But if you need things bigger or smaller, please just let me know. And I'm happy to shrink or grow things kind of as we go. All right, so let's start with that user story. We're going to start with an initial sort of test for this. So I basically literally just did a Rails new, so I've got nothing in here whatsoever. So just as a quick review in my gem file, I need to go add a whole bunch of things, and I'm going to add them inside this development test section here. If you want the Rails new command that I did, I'll just paste that in the Zoom chat for you here. And I'll just break this down a little bit for you. The underscore 5.2.4.3 underscore, if you've got multiple versions of Rails installed, you can actually add this to the Rails command before the new command. And that it will basically say which version of Rails you want to use. If you've got 5.2.4.4, you can do 5.2.4.4. If that's the only version of Rails that you've got installed, that would be fine as well. But like if I do Rails -v, I think it tells me I've got version 6 by default. And so well, in this case, I've got 5.2.4.4 in this folder, but outside of this folder, it may tell me I've got Rails 6 installed. And so that underscore command will actually let you pick an exact version of Rails that you want to use for making a project. The -t just says I don't want to do mini tests. Because I want to set up RSpec. -d for our database, and then we're skipping turbo links and spring, which are just turbo links is a way to like reload part of a page, and spring is kind of a mechanism that sort of watches when changes happen to automatically reload Rails S, but we're not going to bother with any of that with this project. So excuse me. All right. So from here, I need to add a bunch of stuff to my gem file, and we're going to need RSpec Rails in here for doing our testing, and we're also going to need Capybara. We're going to need our good friend Pry, and we're probably going to need shoulda matchers. Oops, gem shoulda matchers. So we're just going to add these in as our gems for today, and this will just help us kick off our test-driven development. Then I'm going to go here and I'm going to run bundle just to make sure that we get all those other gems installed. Cool, all done there. And then we're pretty much ready to go. Now I need to start with a database, so I'm going to do a Rails DB create. You can do a rake DB create if you want. We just have to have some kind of database structure created. We see that makes both our development and our test database. And then I'm going to do Rails G RSpec install, and that's going to set up our RSpec environment. Oops, unless I spell it wrong. As smart as our computers are, they will only do exactly what we tell them to do. They won't try to guess too often. Cool. So now the structure of our testing environment is up and running. Now I've got a spec folder. Now I can start by writing a test. The important thing to remember here, inside the spec folder, we can make additional subfolders that will tell RSpec what kind of test it is. And so I'm going to start with a folder just called features. Adam, you had a question. What's up?
Yeah, I just wanted to pause for a second. I haven't seen that method RailsG RSpec install. That I just want to make sure I understand. That's just creating the spec folder structure, correct?
It is. It's doing a couple of things for us. So RailsG is it's what we call a generator. And RailsG is used for a lot of things like making migrations and scaffolding out whole sections of a website or a web app where it can make controllers and models and do a bunch of tests and all that kind of stuff. In this case, now that we've added the RSpec Rails gem, we have access to this RSpec install command. And yeah, we're making this .rspec, which is a file at the root of our project. And this .rspec file is basically just holding basic instructions about this. Like we can say how we want it to sort of run our tests and so on. So it's kind of a configuration file. And then it's making the spec folder for us. And then inside of that, it's making these two files, spec helper and Rails helper. Most of the configuration that we'll be doing throughout mod 3, where we're going to be adding things for our test environment, we'll be putting inside the Rails helper file here. So in all of our tests, the very first thing that we put at the top of all of our tests is going to be require Rails helper. And that's this file. And that's going to say like, go load all this other like test environment stuff. These files are basically doing things like go load every model, go load every controller, go load every bit of library code, so that you don't have to remember to like require all those individual files in order to run a test. And so it's going through and it's kind of like preloading all this stuff into memory so that it can run your tests. It's also going to have other setup that we'll see for other testing tools that we're going to get into on Friday. Just like other configuration stuff about how our test environment is going to work.
Yeah. Cool, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking. All right, so let's dive in here. So now I've got my features folder, and basically what that's telling RSpec is any file I put in here now, I want to be considered a feature test. So I'm going to start with just a file called user registration spec.rb. All of our test files have to end in _spec for RSpec to pick it up. You could make a subfolder in here if you want to and just call it like user. And in, we could move the file in there if we want, and we could just call it registration spec. If we don't want like user registration spec and user login spec, if they're all related to user, we could just put them in a user folder under features. Either way would be fine. So for now, I'm going to put it in that folder, and I'm just going to call it registration spec. So the first thing we do up here is we require our Rails helper. And that just says like go preload all that stuff that we just talked about. And then we start with an rspec.describe. And here we can give it a string of some sort of what we're going to do. And so we'll just call this like user registration. Now there is a flag that we can add here where I can say this is a type of feature test. This is if you really wanted to put like, I really want this to be a model test and I want it to live in some other folder. This way, when RSpec is scanning through all these files, it'll say, well, even though I found it in this folder, I'm going to treat it as this kind of test, because RSpec is actually smart enough to know when you're making a feature test versus what we call a request test once we get into API development, that it loads things a little bit differently for Capybara to work. In this case, we don't have to say that it's a type of feature because we're already in a folder called features. And so this is the important distinction to make. If you want to sort of customize the folder structure of your tests, you may need to add this type flag in your tests so that RSpec knows what kind of test you intend this to be. In our case, because we're in a features folder, we don't have to specify this. And so I'm not going to bother with that right now. I like to put all my ends in because I tend to forget those. And so the first thing I'm going to describe is happy path. Happy path is just, I expect my user's going to do what I want them to do. And it's a good idea as well to have like a sad path at some point, or maybe edge case at some point, where you're saying like, what if they can't register properly? Or what if they try to put in a poop emoji instead of their username? What do we do instead? And so that would be more edge case testing, where sad path is, what if they, put in something that doesn't look like an email address? That's more sad path because they're kind of following it, but it's kind of like a sad outcome. So when we talk about happy path and sad path, happy path is they're doing everything that we expect them to do. So from here, we're just going to write this out as a test, and we're going to say it allows a user to register. All right, so from here, we're going to visit our root path. I like to actually use path helpers instead of like hard coding routes in here. Path helpers give us a little more flexibility around building our application. We can move routes around and still give them the same sort of prefix name, and then we don't have to change any code. So as much as possible, try to use these path helpers in your testing and within your code. You'll find it'll give you more flexibility kind of as we go. So when we're on our home page, we're kind of like dreaming out here what we want to do. We want to click on something that says register as a user. Now, if we don't know if we're going to make a link or a button, then we can say click on. If we know it's going to be a button, we should say click button. If we know it's going to be a link, we should say click link. But since we don't know yet how we're going to go build it, we're still kind of dreaming out what we're going to do. I'm going to say click on. Eventually, it would be good to kind of circle back and go, well, now that we know it's a button, let's actually say click on button instead, or click button, so that Capybara has a little bit more of explicit instructions of what to do here. And then we're going to expect that our current path is going to equal a new user path. And this is the typical prefix that we would see when we're going to make a resource for something in Rails, where we're going to load the sort of the new form as we go. So from here, now we need to specify like what username and password do we want to use. So I'm just going to store these as variables, and we'll say our username is Tim the skier. Tim likes to ski, and our password is going to be Frankie. It's the name of his dog. He uses it as a password all the time. Go ahead and hack his accounts. He won't mind. And now we're going to fill in. We're going to imagine that we're going to have, actually, you know what? Let's not use a username. Let's use an email address instead. And we'll just do like example.com. Most user registrations, they will allow you to use a username or a password. In this case, I'm actually going to I like using emails more. It tends to be a little more unique, and you tend to have fewer people trying to collide on like trying to go get that really awesome username. And so let's use email addresses here instead. So I'm going to dream out like we're going to have an email field, and we want to fill this in with the value of our email address. And we're going to fill in our password field with our password. And then from here, we're going to click, usually on a form, it's going to be a button. So we'll click on a button that says create user. And now I'm going to expect my page to have content that says welcome email. So we'll just expect that we're going to echo that email back to them and say, welcome to our site. We could also put an expectation up here that we expect our page, or expect our current path to equal our root path. So let's just say like once we register, we're going to kick them back to that welcome page, but we're going to show them a message saying welcome to the site. Any questions on how I set that up so far? I love Frankie123. Yep, that's Tim's password everywhere. Awesome. Cool. All right, let's keep going then. So if I go out here and I go and run that R spec on Rails, there we go. All right, so saying I don't have a root path. So I'm trying to go to a root path and I don't have a root path. So in VS Code and in Atom, if you hit Command T, you can start typing the name of a file. In this case, I can just start typing routes and just hit enter, and it'll load up our routes file, which is completely empty to start out with. So we're going to start with just a root path. We can do this a couple of ways. We can say I want to get slash and I want to go to like a welcome controller with an index method. We can do it this way, or we can say my root is going to welcome index. Either of these will work. I like keeping this one in and just having root. That just lets me know what the root of my thing is. But if you want to use the get, that's fine. It's just the verb that we're doing and the path that the user is going to go to, and then the controller and the action method. So either way is fine. Can't have both. You can use one or the other. I'm going to use root, but you can use whichever one you like. All right. So now it's just saying I don't have my welcome controller, and this is where I'm going to kind of go through this stuff a little bit quicker, because you should all be pros at making controllers and so on from here. So I'm just going to go make a new file, call it my welcome controller, and a class of welcome controller, and that's inheriting from my application controller. Now that's all my test told me I needed. So I'm a big fan of TDD and just following my TDD process. It said I didn't have a controller. I made a controller. Now it's going to complain I don't have my index method. So now I'm going to go add that. Go run my test again. Cool. And now I don't have a template. So we'll go down here to our views, and inside views, I need to make a folder. So another trick in Atom and VS Code, you can say, I want to make a file. And if you give it a path in here as well and say welcome / it'll create the subfolder for you as well. So I'm going to make welcome / index.html.erb, and it's going to make the folder and the file all at the same time. All right, and then from here, we just can't find the thing to click on that says register as a user. All right, so from here, let's just go make that as a link to start out with. So we're going to use our link to helper, and I'm just going to say register as a user. And not quite sure yet where that's going to go, but it couldn't find a link or a button with that name. Now that I've made it a link, it says, okay, well, now, like, I don't know what this new user path thing is. So now it's actually like a little bit farther down in my test. But now that I know that this is going to be a link, I'm actually going to go back to my test, and I'm going to say I want to click link instead of click on. So again, this is where we can get more and more specific. Because we're building a form, we know that's going to be a button. In this case, our registration is going to be a link. So it's better for Capybara to say, go click on a link that says register as a user. That way, if you had like a header that actually said like register as a user, and under that you had a big button, Capybara is actually going to try to click on the header because it found that text and it's trying to click on that, but it's not going to do anything. That's why we want to be as specific as possible about what we're telling Capybara to click on within our test. All right, so now it's complaining. Let's see, on line, what line is it complaining on? Our test is on line 5. It's complaining on line 10. So line 10 is that we're expecting our current path to be this new user path. And it says, I have no idea what that is. And so we're actually going to set that to be our link. So when we click on it, we're going to try to go there. But it's telling us like, hey, I don't know what this new user path thing even is. So now we need to go build that as a resource in our routes. So back in here, I'm going to set up a resource. And this is going to be for a user. But I only want to make my new page. So we don't want to just say like resource user, because we don't want to build all of those RESTful routes. To get started with, we're only going to build our new page. So I like to do this. I like to restrict and only build what I need. That way my application isn't exposing routes that maybe somebody could interact with that I don't want them to. So I'm just being really specific about only the routes that I want to have available in my application. All right, so now we don't have the user controller to actually like, so saying click on a link, register as a user, and it doesn't have a user controller. And that's coming from line 8 of our registration spec. So in our registration spec on line 8. So let's go back there. So it's complaining all the way up here, register as a user. It's trying to click on that link and it says, I have no idea what that user controller is. That's because that's trying to go to a user resource, which we haven't even started building out yet. So it needs that in order to load up the form. So now we need to go build our user controller. So inside controllers, we're going to go build a new file. And this is going to be users plural controller. Remember, your controllers have to be plural and your models have to be singularly named. So we're going to make a class of users controller. Oops. And that's coming from application controller. And now it should complain that we don't have a new method. Yep, have new. So def new. All right, and now we don't have a template for that. So now we come back under views, I say new file. Now I make a users / new.html.erb, and it makes our users folder and our new file as well. And so this is the template where we're going to build out our form. Cool. Let's take a pause there, see if there's any questions. Am I going too fast, going too slow? How you feeling so far? Good review? Are y'all awake over there? You're all very quiet.
You generally use that singular resource syntax, like when you're just doing one route, or is it because something else?
On the routes itself?
Yeah, so like usually I would use the, and I've seen the plural, like resources, users only, new.
Oh, did I spell it wrong?
No, I don't think you did. That's the thing. I think you can do it this way, and you said resource user, so you went singular, and then I wasn't sure if that was like if there was any reason.
Isn't it supposed to be?
I just checked
No,
our
it's
like internal
yeah.
apps and was like, okay.
Oh yeah, it should be plural. It should be plural. You're right.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, it should be plural. Yeah, good catch. See, I'm human too. I get it wrong. All right, so we're still going to a user's controller over here, but we want to make sure that the path is users new, not user new. Yeah, so it does need to be plural because we do want that path to be that, which means our prefix now is new users path, which means our link is going to be wrong as well. So cool, I'm glad you caught that. That would have really messed us up along the way. So let's go back over here. Let's see, register as a user. I need to go to that template and correct that template. And that is going to be in our welcome page. Where's my welcome page at? Here it is. So this will be new users plural path. Cool. Yeah, thanks for catching that, Tim. Other questions? People are saying in the chat it was a trick question. It wasn't a trick question. I made a mistake. Adam, what do you got?
Yeah, I was under the impression that the path is still new user path singular. I haven't seen.
So whatever we call the resource in our routes, it's going to use that as a prefix name here for our path helpers. So because we made users plural now, it also changed our path helper. Where before, when the resource was singularly named, it had a single name here, but it should have been plural.
Yeah,
so
I totally agree with that.
Okay.
I just, in my past projects, I've done it where it's user / new, but my if you go back to the, I think it was the controller, the new _ user _ path, or that view, the index, sorry.
Yeah.
I always had that as singular, but I'll try both maybe when I practice.
Cool. And some folks are asking if I did it right in the routes file as well. Does resources have to be plural? I don't think so. It's not complaining about any of that. Oh, now you're all confusing me.
I've usually seen it as plural, but so that's why I was surprised. Like it just worked as singular.
So even the resource, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
I thought
It reads better as resource to me, but I've always seen it as resources, and like I think that's like I'm pretty sure that's how we generally teach it in Mod 2.
Okay. New users path. Well, now it doesn't like new users path. So now if we do rig routes.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was new user singular path for the path.
Huh.
Yeah. So if we make the resource word plural, then it changes our path helper. All right. So this is where things like as developers are like, which way are we supposed to do it? If you're used to doing plural resources, then that's fine. We'll keep if I keep the singular of user, does that change the route to be? Yeah, so we want the route to be plural. So we'll do resources users. So we'll just make everything plural. How's that? So now in here, this will be new user path. Is that right? Yeah, so now it'll be new user path, but everything else will be plural. So our path helper will be singularly named, but our routes will be plural resources, plural users. All right. So when I first started teaching Mod 2, I got so caught up on pluralization that I actually joked with the class I was going to start the equivalent of like a swear jar, and every time I got the pluralization wrong, I was going to put $1 in there. And by the end of the inning, we're all going to fly to Cabo and have a nice vacation because I kept messing it up. I messed it up every single time, and now I'm messing it up again. All right, so let's go fix that path helper here, new user path, and we need to change our test, make sure that that's also a new user path singularly as well. Everyone's now asking in the chat, where are we going for a vacation? Cool, let's check this real quick. And if our test is still failing where I expect it to fail, yep, so now it's just failing because it doesn't have a form. Cool, let's do a palm break and we'll come back in 5. And maybe spend that 5 minutes thinking about like, where would you go on a dream vacation if we could travel and not worry about quarantine when you get there and stuff. Cool. See you back in 5. Everybody's smiling faces up over here on my other screen so I can see all y'all. There we go. Cool. See people drinking water. That's good. Stay hydrated. All right. So let's get back on track now that we got my routing issues figured out. All right, so where we left off, we were basically at a point where we need to go build our form. So we're going to use a form helper called form with. Did y'all use form with in mod 2, or did you use form for and form tag?
We use with.
Use with, okay, cool. So with will let us use both models and URLs. It gives us a little more flexibility. And the form for and the form tag are actually being deprecated. So we want to gradually get everybody over to using the form with helper instead. Cool. So in here, we're just going to do kind of the same thing that we would have done before. I'm just going to copy this out of the lesson plan just for speed. And we're going to call this email instead of username. And call this email. Cool. So we've got a label and a field and a label and a field. We want to make sure that this is a password field and not a text field because we want it to like mask what the person's typing in. And then when we do a form.submit, it's automatically going to make a button for us. And this string here should match what we've got in our test. So in our test, we're looking for a button called create user. And so now that part of the test should pass as far as finding the finding that field that we were looking for before. All right, so now we got through all of that. Now it's just saying, well, the form doesn't know how to post our data back to Rails. So we need to go make sure that that route exists. So we don't have a route for users new. Wait, that's a different error. Oh yeah, it's the post, right? Because we need to create on this. So we need to create. So now the routes should be there. Now we should just not have a create action method in our user controller. Nope, it doesn't like that path. All right. Rake routes. Yes, that's not going to the right spot. All right, now what did I do? So making a form. Do I need, no, I don't have to tell it to do a post. It's trying to do a post. So now what's going on with my code? I tested this the other night and it worked fine.
Hey, Ian.
Yeah.
Before I've had to like define the path in the form with. So if you do like path is the user's path or user path.
So
and
we
then the
shouldn't
method
have
is
to,
post.
but we shouldn't have to with a model. Okay. So talk me through that. How would we fix this then?
So just right there, you just add, let me see, I just did this. Yeah, you just add path colon and then users underscore path. So then it's directing to that route.
Okay.
Because
Oops, let's run our spec again. Nope, still doesn't
I
like
still
that.
didn't do it. Oh, do you have to set local to true?
Shouldn't have to though.
No.
That stuff should all be part of the form helper. Adam, what do you got? Can you help us
Yeah,
out?
so I think the form width knows if at user already has information, it knows that it's not like a post or create. So maybe in the controller we need
Ah,
in def create like an at user equals nothing or
that's right. Yep. That's exactly what we need. So what's happening here is the form is trying to guess what we want to do because we've said, I'm going to give you something called at user. It says, okay, well, I guess I need to make a path about user, but we don't have a user model and we haven't given it any data to know, are we making something new or is this going to be an edit form where we need to pre-populate that? So yeah, good catch there. So all we need to do in our controller, so we're going to go to our user controller and we need to say something like at user equals user.new. And that way our form knows, oh, you want to make a new user. But now we're going to fail because we don't have a user model. And so this is actually going to fail. And now we have to kind of switch gears and go build our model from here. All right, so it's saying our controller doesn't know what I mean by user. So let's go build our migration for this. And we'll go build our testing around that. So we're going to use our Rails G migration. And we're going to say create users. And here we're going to use email, which is a string. And we're going to have something called password digest, which is also a string. And we'll get into why we call it digest in a minute. Now, we can leave off the string identifier and it'll default to string. I like being explicit on these things and say, like, I expect this to be a string in the database. So it made a migration for us. So let's go apply that migration right away because I often forget. So we'll go build that first. Someone asked in chat, do we want user.all? In this case, no, because we don't, like, we're not trying to make an index page to show all of our users. We're just trying to make a form so that we can add one user. All right, so we've added that migration. Ryan, I saw you unmuted. Did you have something?
Oh, just is at users, you're using plural users. Would it be singular if it's just making one new user?
No, in this case, the table name that we want to create is going to be plural. So at a database level, our tables are always plurally named. And so
I
if we
wasn't
go
talking
look
about
at
the database. I'm
Oh, sorry.
talking about back in the controller. You're
Oh,
making
yeah.
right there.
Yep, that will need to be singularly named. Yeah, sorry, I thought
Okay.
you meant about the migration here.
Yeah, I was late to my question. Yeah.
No, no worries. No worries. I appreciate you asking. All right, so now that we've made the migration, we need to actually go build some model testing for this as well. So let's go back into our spec and we'll make a file. We're going to make a path called models with user spec.rb. And that's going to make the folder for us. And now anything that we make under here will be treated as a model test in here. So we're going to require in our Rails helper. And we're going to rspec describe. And now we can give it just the name of the model class. We don't have to put it in a string. And if we wanted to, we could say this is a model test, but we don't have to because we're in a models folder. We don't have to specify the type. But if you want to be explicit, that's totally okay. So in here, we're going to describe some validations that we want to do, validations. And in here, this is where we're going to pull up our shoulda matchers in here. So we should say it should validate presence of our email. And V, you got a question? What's up?
I was just wondering about indentation. What is the like official rule? Because I've seen structures starting from the very like beginning there, but you have like an extra indentation.
The structure of like the test itself?
Overall, everything like, you know, when you do the tab,
Mhm.
so it looks to me that compared to other things that I've seen, you have an extra one. You know what I mean?
Oh, like an extra tab?
Yeah.
Just the default in my editor is a 4-space tab. That's all.
Okay, that doesn't matter.
Yeah. Nope. white space
Okay.
actually doesn't matter at all. We could totally like unindent all of this if we wanted to. It would still run just fine. We really only
I mean, more
indented
like
just.
Mhm.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I mean more like a convention. Like when we roll, what is it, Robocop, whatever is the gem that help us format things. Will it say anything about indentation, or it's just going to ignore that?
It should ignore it because white space really doesn't matter for this
Okay.
stuff. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Cool. All right, so let's go run this RSpec again. Now this is going to go run all of our tests. Our feature test is going to keep failing at this point. So what I want to do now is I want to actually isolate the tests that we're running. So in this case, we're still failing because we don't have a user model, but eventually I do want to run just this test. And so I'm just going to like RSpec, and I'm just going to copy that in, and this will just run my whole like user model test. Cool, so at this point we don't have a user model, so we'll go up here and we'll build that under models, make a file called user.rb. Sam, what's up?
Should it be validate uniqueness of password digest instead of just password?
Nope, but we'll get there. Okay. So we did call it password digest in our migration, but we're actually going to validate the presence of something called password, and we'll get into why when we get into like what hashing is and what bcrypt is doing for us. So we'll get there. So this is coming from application record. So now we have a model. So now we should see that our feature test is failing. Now, all three of these tests are failing because we haven't built any of the actual validations in here yet. And so we're going to say that this is going to validate our email. And we're going to say the uniqueness is true. And our presence is also true. So that should pass 2 of those tests for us. But it did not. Did I spell it right? Validate presence. Oh, I didn't set up shoulda matchers. So there's some configuration that we need to do for shoulda matchers. And that's going to be at the very bottom of our Rails helper. So at the very bottom of the Rails helper, we need to add some code in here to tell shoulda matchers how to work. And that is in the lesson plan for you. You can just copy and paste that out of there. Basically, what this is complaining about is it doesn't have access to these methods, validate presence of, validate uniqueness of. It doesn't have those from the shoulda matchers gem. So we just need to add this configuration block. It is in the lesson plan. You can just copy that at the very, very bottom of your Rails helper. It doesn't need to be inside this config block. It's just down at the very, very bottom of that file. So come back out here. We'll run those tests again. Cool. So 2 of those tests now pass because I added this one line of code to our model saying that I'm validating the uniqueness and the presence of our email. Now, if I try to validate the presence of our password here, though, presence of password, where we require this to be true, that means we have to have a password no matter what. This is where it's going to start complaining because we called it password digest, but we're trying to make something with something called password. Oops, did I spell something else wrong? Per user. Oh, yeah. So it's complaining because we're trying to use password digest and it's saying, I don't know what you're trying to validate the presence of. So this is where sometimes the error messages aren't super, super clear. But it's basically saying, I don't know how to validate the presence of that thing. So let's take kind of a side trip a little bit into why we're calling this password digest. When we talk about what a hash actually is, the hash is a data structure is actually based on a math formula called a hash method. And what this is doing is it's turning some data into what we call a digest. It's basically looking for like an alphanumeric representation of some data that should be unique in nature. And the stronger the hash method that we use, the more unique this digest is going to be. But there's always possibility for collision. And collision basically means if I take the word mushroom and I make a digest out of that, and then I take the word coffee and I make a digest out of that, that they should never be the same. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use a new gem called bcrypt. It's actually already in your gem file. It's just going to be commented out. So if you go look at your gem file, it should already be in here, just commented. So we just want to uncomment that line. So we're just going to uncomment our bcrypt, and then we have to go run bundle because we have to make sure that it installs that gem for us. And then what bcrypt is going to do is it's basically going to handle the digest of this password for us. So when the user gives us a plain text password, it's going to do a one-way encryption on this. Now, we don't know what the encryption is doing, and we shouldn't know what it's doing because we never want to be able to decrypt that password back into plain text. And so this is something that we call a one-way hash. So think of it like a one-way street. Things can only go in one direction. And we'll get into this a little bit more once we do the login. This will start to make a little more sense. But the other thing that the bcrypt gem is going to do for us is it's going to take care of this mismatch between our user giving us something called password and our schema, which is storing it as password digest. And it's also going to help us here around this saying, like, I want to validate this thing about our password. And so all we need to do in here is we add this other keyword that says has secure password. And this comes from the bcrypt gem. And this basically says, I want to secure the passwords. And this is how it's going to do the encryption for us. Now, the other nice thing that bcrypt can do is it can also handle a password confirmation field. So you might see that on the occasional registration form where they ask you to type in a password and they ask you to type it in again. And that's because they're hiding what you're typing as a password. And they're asking you to type it again just so you make sure that you're spelling your password correctly. Because if you only type it in once and you spell it wrong and you think you know what your password is, and you try and log in later and it doesn't work, now you got to go through a whole password reset, which is kind of a nuisance sometimes. So bcrypt will also handle a password confirmation field for you. If you want to add that in your project, that'd be great. All right, so we're adding that in here. If we come back now and run our spec, let's see if it gets us past that validate uniqueness of. So it's still complaining about that. So let's go in and dive in a little bit more on this and see what's going on here. So we're validating the presence of our password. We're requiring that to be true. Yeah, Isabel, what do you have?
I'm pretty sure it's because it's on line 5. It should be validates presence of.
Me and my spelling and pluralization again. That's like 5 in one class. I'm on a roll here. All right, awesome. I mean, we still need to do the has secure password thing anyway. But that would have tripped up other things. So actually, if I comment this out, we'll actually see what other errors actually pop up here. So now it's saying, like, I don't know what the password thing is because it's called password digest. So it's complaining about that. So we'll just re-enable that. Come back here, run all our tests. And now all of our model tests are passing. Now we're back on our feature test saying, okay, well, now I can't find the field called email that isn't disabled. But we made that in our form over here. So I'm just going to close all the model things because we're done with our model. So we made a field up here called email, but it doesn't know, like it can't find that field in here. So we've given it a user model and it's saying, I don't know what this email thing is. So what we can do now is we're going to add one more gem called Launchy. Did anybody of you use Launchy in mod 2?
Hopefully all of you.
Hopefully all of them. All right. So I'm just going to go bundle that one in. So this will allow us to save an open page and we can actually go take a look at the HTML of what's going on our page. So in our test, I'm going to close this up, and in our test over here, I'm just going to add save an open page and go run that test again. It's going to pop it up in a browser, and I'll pull that browser window over to the screen here. So this is our wonderfully, beautifully styled registration page. What we can do here is we can view the page source, or we can go into inspect. I'm just going to view the page source. And what we see in here is what the HTML is that actually got built from this. And what we see here is the name of it is actually user email with square brackets. And the ID that it gave it is actually user_email and user_password. And that's because this is based on a model called user. It's actually prefixing all of these field names with user. So this is where sometimes when we're doing test-driven development, we say, well, this is kind of what I want to happen. And I build a test about that. But once I start actually implementing it, I realize my test is actually wrong. And it's okay to go back and refine the test. It doesn't mean you have to write the code exactly the way that the test is expecting it to be. You're allowed to go back and change your test. In this case, I did this on purpose. And so in our test over here, we say, I want to fill in user_email and user_password. Because what's happening here is Capybara is actually looking for something with that name. Can't really show both on here at the same time, but it's looking for this ID. So Capybara is, when we say fill in user email, it's actually looking for this as an ID, as a CSS ID within the HTML. So it's looking for this field right here to know where to go put that value. And so that's how we can use Launchy to actually go look at the HTML to figure out what's going wrong with our form. All right, so now that we got that, I don't need to save an open page anymore. Let's go see if that actually passes, or at least get past that part. Cool, so that works. Now we need to go actually save this in our database and do a create in here. So let's go over here and we'll go make our def create. Now, when we do a create, we usually redirect after that. And so the next error that we're going to get is that we're not back on the welcome page because we're calling create. We're not doing anything with the data yet, but it's saying I expected to get my root path and I'm still on my user's path. And so at the bottom of our create, we would typically do a redirect to, in this case, we're going to redirect back to our root path. So it'll get past that error. And now it's going to say, well, now I expected the welcome message to show up on that page and I don't see that. So all it sees is the link that we had there to begin with. So let's go do something with this data and we'll actually save that. And then we'll show like a flash message or something there. So when we create things, we typically want to use our strong params. So I'm just going to go build a private method and we'll call this user params. And who wants to help me build this out? I'll give you 3 seconds to volunteer and then I'm going to pick somebody. Going once, going twice. Eli is going to help me out. Oh, too late, James. Too late. All right, Eli. Cool. What do I need to build in here for some strong params?
So you're going to do params.require user.
Yep.
.permit and email and password.
Yep. Great. Perfect. Thank you. Cool. So now up here, then we're going to say we're going to do a user.create and we're going to pass in that user params. And that should go save that in our database. But we need to do something with it if we're going to do that flash message. So we'll do something like new user equals, and then we can do a flash message from here. And we'll use our success. Now, the neat thing about these flash messages, the label that you use here, once you start getting into like Tailwind and Bootstrap, it may predefine some things called success or info or warning, and it'll actually style those things for you. So you can actually get into some pretty cool effects where we can just say this is a flash of success, and then it'll like show up in like a green square or something on the page. For those that aren't red, green colorblind, they would be able to see that. So that's also why we have to take color into consideration when we're building these things out. But that's just a little hint there that you can use those flash message types to actually pre-define some styling on your site and actually do some interesting styling effects around that. V, you had a question. What's up?
Yeah, just 2 questions. I want to confirm that I understand this right. In your strong params, when you use require, I remember there's something related to security, but also you use it when your hash is nested, right?
That's right. Yep.
And
so
how
let's
do
go.
you know? Okay.
Yep. So we'll go run that right now. So that was a great question. So let's go take a look at what's actually in our params. So all I did was I put a pry in our strong params method. And what we can see here is that it built out this, this key. So remember, params is just a hash of keys and values. We have a key called user, and inside of that, we have our email and our password. We also see the button that came in. So the button was called commit, and the value of the button that they actually clicked on was create user. We see the controller that it's coming to, and we see the action that it's coming to. So some of this stuff gets populated by Rails. But in this case, it put all of the user information of the email and the password inside of a hash as a key called user. And so in our strong params, we say, I want to require this user key to be there. If that's not there, then whatever they're trying to send me is not valid. And so it first does a check and says, do I have something in here called user? In this case, yes, I do. Now within that block, I want to make sure that they're not trying to like say, well, I'm an admin user or something like that and like do all this other stuff. So within this subhash, I'm only going to permit a field called email and a field called password. And so if they try to send anything else, I'm just going to ignore it. These are the only things that I'm going to allow to come in from this.
Okay, and does it, is the reason why it nested is because you have two things for the use? If you had only one, you wouldn't nest?
No, the reason that it got nested is because of our form. So the form helper that we made over here, because it was built on a model of user, all of these fields are based on the user model. And so by putting a model in our form helper, it actually just automatically nests all that stuff for us. In fact, if we go back to our browser here, we can actually see under the name, this kind of looks like hash syntax right here. And that's actually how that name gets turned into the params block. It's actually using user here as the sub key or as the key, and then email and password as elements under that key. And that's how that actually gets turned into a hash. So Rails is looking at this string coming in and go, that kind of looks like a hash. I'm going to put that in params as a hash. And I'm going to make a key called user. And inside of that, I'm going to make email. And the value of that is going to be whatever they put in that input field. And so that's how that actually gets built into params. Yeah. All right, let's keep going. Don't want to run out of time here. So, so we got all that done. Where do we leave off? We're in our controller. So we got our strong params done. So now we're going to save that as a new user. And then in here, I can say like new user email. And then this should build a flash message, but we haven't done a flash message in our main layout yet. So we got to go manually build that as well. So if I try to exit here and just go run RSpec again. Cool. So it still doesn't see it on the page. We are building the flash message. We're just not consuming that flash message in our layout. So in our view layouts application HTML, we're just going to add a block in here in our body before the yield. This is where all of the other template code goes. But right before this, this is where we're going to put our flash content. And I'm just going to grab that out of the lesson plan for speed. And just put that in here. Again, indentation doesn't really matter, but it's nice to be kind of clean and formatted. So what we're going to do here is we're going to pull out the name, which is our success, for example. And this is where we can build that as a class. And so now when that actually gets built on the page, any CSS library that you have, it can use that class and do some styling around it. So if you're going to do like color coding or positioning on the page, if it was a success or a failure, things like that, we can do all kinds of interesting things with that. So now if we go back and run that, we should be passing. And we are. So now we've got a user registration system set up. So a little bit of effort. Took us about an hour going through and debug a little bit. Tim, you got a question? What's up? Or comment?
Can we go see if it works on the development environment server?
Yeah, sure. So we'll go run Rails S. Go back over to my browser here, close this down, and let's actually go to Windows 3000. Oops, 3000. Too many zeros. All right, so now we're going to register as a user. And we're going to say Tim the skier at gmail.com with Cranky is a good boy. Great user.
Okay, that's what I expected.
Yeah. So what?
Glad.
Yep. So what happened here? So we got to a point where we selected, we inserted into the table. That all worked, but it didn't actually redirect us afterwards. So what do we think happened here? So this is where just because our test passes doesn't mean our code actually worked. So what do we think happened here? Any volunteers? Behavior-driven development for the win. That's right, James. So what happened here? Our test passes, but the code doesn't actually work.
Seeds, maybe?
Well, there's nothing to seed because we're asking the user to give us the data to put in the database in the first place. We go look at the form. We see the action. It's going to /users. We see it's doing a method post. Let's go to Alex first and then Phil.
I think you're going to need the local true in the form.
You think so? All right. So let's go take a look at the form helper for that. Do a local true. All right. So let's go refresh this and we'll type in Tim the skier at email.com and Frankie. And that worked. So form with will actually use JavaScript to try to submit some forms. And we haven't actually set up our app in such a way to allow that JavaScript to actually submit. So it's actually trying to do some AJAX under the hood to actually submit that form instead of actually doing a post operation where it refreshes the whole page. And that's kind of the downside of using form with. So yeah, in this case, we did need the local true. Yep. Thanks for that. Phil, did you have something else?
No, I think that was pretty much what I was going for. I was curious if you look at your Rails console, like the output from your server requests.
Yep.
One thing I saw on my end, where it says like started post users. If you go up to before you changed it to local equals true, like you can kind of debug this because it says you processing by welcome controller as JavaScript, as JS. So if you ever see that, it's thinking it'll be helpful to see that.
Yep. And this is why we got to pay attention to our error messages and so on. Yep. Thanks for that, Phil.
Yep. And it also has it. It also has it up there that along with the post. So it tried to post. It tried to post as JS there too.
Yep. Yep. Good catch, everybody.
I had a curiosity.
Sure. What's up, Ryan?
I was just wondering, like, by adding the local true, does that actually add any HTML attributes or anything to the front end, or like if you were to just look on your development or your local server?
So if we go back over here and we look at the form now, so view page source.
Any HTML attribute? It doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, it took away one.
Yeah.
So the attribute that was there before was data remote true that I saw, and then now that is not the case.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's because of all this JavaScript and stuff that it's doing up in here. Like it's loading in some action cable, and active storage and all this kind of stuff that we don't even really get into. Max, you had your hand up as well. What's up?
Yeah, when we were running this in the test and within the strong params, we had the binding.pry. It showed the actual password, but now on the server side, we're seeing the password digest. Why did it show the actual password when we were in pry before?
Yeah, so when we were in pry, let me see if I can scroll up to where that was. So when we're in pry and we're looking at all of params, it's showing us everything that came in the form as is. But basically what's happening now is when we hand this off to our user.create at the model level, and let me go back over to the code here. So if I pull up my user model, because we have the has secure password, basically what's going to happen is that password gets hashed. And that's that one-way encryption that I was talking about. And it's basically making like a big fingerprint out of that and then turning it into that like really random looking digest string. And we actually see down here in the output, it actually, yeah, it turns it into this. And that's because the console is showing us what actually got inserted into the database. And that is our password digest, as opposed to showing us the plain text password. We never, ever, ever want to store a plain text password in our database. That makes us a huge security target.
Okay, so just to confirm, the actual conversion of it or the hashing of it happens server side once it gets passed down the path.
Yep. And so we go from our user controller where we're doing user.create. That's going to take the plain password and then go look at the user model where we're saying I have I want to use a secure password because of the bcrypt gem. And bcrypt then will take a look at how we're trying to make that user model. It'll see that you've got a password field. It'll also check if there's a password confirmation, and it'll make sure that those are the same as well. And it'll say, hey, now that I have this password, before I actually save this in the database, I have to convert this into like this one-way encrypted string. And that's where it generated this for us. And that's going to be different for every user, even if they have the exact same password. It uses a lot of randomness, what we call entropy. And it's actually going to randomly sort of generate this one-way encryption. It should take until the sun burns out to turn this back into plain text if the hash is like doing its job.
Can I ask one more follow-up question on that?
Yeah,
that may
absolutely.
be not relevant, but how do they then detect if your password is the same password that you used before if you changed it?
Yep. What they're doing there is they're actually storing another table of previous passwords where they're doing this kind of thing. So even though it's using some amount of random entropy for creating this one-way hash, they may be also using a second kind of hash that that's not as random, that is saying like, actually, you've already used that password in the past. I've seen sites where it's like, you can't use any of the last 5 passwords. I've seen other sites where it's like, you can't ever use a password again, which means they're storing a lot of information about your passwords. And that's really bad. The other nice thing about this password digest is it doesn't matter how long or how short our password is. It's always going to turn it into a string of this length, no matter what. It's going to be random enough and unique enough that, whether you give it a 3-letter password or all of the text to like the book War and Peace, like however long your password is, it's always going to turn into a string this size. And that's good from a database perspective because now we can have a fixed size of that string in the database. And it's also good because we don't have to say to our user like, oh, your password can only be a maximum of 30 characters long. It doesn't matter the maximum length anymore. And so if you're ever on a site where they say, oh, sorry, your password can't be more than 20 characters long, that means they're not hashing it correctly. They're not doing something in a very secure way on their side. A minimum length is meant to be like, we're protecting your account from being attacked because people are randomly trying every sequence of letter and number and punctuation symbol. And so having a minimum length is a security enforcement, but a maximum length is actually weakening the security because that means that they're doing something with their password storage where like they're not hashing it properly. So if you ever see that on a site, that's kind of a warning flag that, you probably don't want to use that site. Unfortunately, one of my banks says I can only have like up to a 16 character password. And with brute force attack on modern hardware, that would take less than a day to crack. But for some reason, my bank still thinks that's secure. So I don't use that bank very much.
And quick follow-up on
that. Go
ahead.
Yep.
So if every time you input a password, the hash has some degree of randomness, and then when you log in, how does it detect that it's the same password? Because the hash is going to be different than what's stored in the database. Is that just because there's like some form of relative primeness and that they have a key for that? Or how does it work under the hood? Okay.
Yeah, a little bit. And it's something that we call a salt. And that's actually the first part of the password here that we see with the $signs. And it's something that we call a salt. And that's sort of like, I want I want to sort of set my random number generator up in a specific state that, given these random values that I picked at the beginning, if I tell my sort of random number generator to set itself up with these parameters, then when I give it that password, it's always going to come out the same way. And so it's kind of what we call a pseudo random number generator at that point, because we can fake it out a little bit. And so it comes up with a salt in a random fashion, but then it stores the salt as part of the password, as part of the password digest rather, so that when it does the comparison later, it'll actually like pull these values out and say, okay, well, now I'm going to go set up the random number generator using these parameters as the salt. And then when I redigest that password, it should come out with the rest of this being the same. Cool.
Gotcha.
I'll take one more
Thanks.
question, then we'll do a palm break. We still have to build a login form for this. So, Grayson, what do you get?
So because the salt is stored with the password, does that mean it's possible to technically reverse this if, or rather recreate it because someone has access to that salt?
No, the salt by itself is not enough. There are other things that are needed. In Rails, there's a, I forget where it's stored. It's somewhere in the config. There's actually like a really long string that gets generated whenever you do Rails new. And it's like some sort of secure key or secure token or something. It also uses that as part of the process as well. If they have that, then they could probably eventually figure out the actual encryption key for it. But I mean, if they've gotten that far into your application, then you've got bigger things to worry about. But yeah, I mean, anything's possible. I mean, given modern hardware, you know, pretty much anything's possible. But if all they have is this digest, it's going to be nearly impossible for them to crack. Now, once we get into like quantum computing, that's going to change pretty drastically. Quantum computing is going to like break this down by many orders of magnitude, and it will be much faster to crack this kind of encryption. But by that point, hopefully our servers will also be using quantum technologies where the encryption is going to be, you know, many orders of magnitude stronger as well. And so, you know, we're hoping that we'll be able to keep pace with that on a security level.
Thank you.
Cool. It's been a while since we had a palm break, so let's take a break and we'll come back in 5. And then we'll build a login form and then we'll wrap up for the class. So see you back in 5 minutes. See your recording. All right. Cool. So let's dive in. Let's build a login page. So login page is going to feel a lot like what we did for the registration, but we're going to go a lot faster on this one. So I'm going to start with a test. And we're going to do that under features. We'll do it under our user path as well. So make a new file under here, and we'll just call it login spec. Incidentally, I like to call it like registration spec and not like user can register, because I like to have the happy path and sad path stuff in there. And if the user can't register, it'd be nice to also just have like all the registration tests all in one place, all the login tests all in one place, or maybe login, log out tests all in one place. So that's why I like to name my files that way. So we're going to do our Rails helper, then our spec describe user login, and then we'll describe our happy path. And inside here, it allows user login. All right, so similar to what we had before, except in this case, we need to actually go set up a user ahead of time. And this is part of our strong testing sort of sequence. If you remember the seat anagram from mod 1, all the way back in mod 1, setup, exercise, assertion, and teardown. Rails is going to do all the teardown for us, but in this case, we need to do a little bit of setup first. So from here, we're going to visit our root path again. And now we want to find, let's make a link so we'll know ahead of time we're going to make this as a link that says I have an account. And that'll take us to a login page. So now we'll expect that our current path is going to equal, let's call this like login path. And then we'll have some more fill-ins. So we'll do a fill-in. We're going to fill in our email with our user.email. Now, the interesting thing about the test here is we've created a user and we've given it a password field called test. We know that in the database, it's going to save as password digest. But inside our test here, we're still going to have access to the original plain text password that we set in that object. And so we can set our password field here with user.password. I like to reuse these things so I don't have to type them over and over again. If I change the username up here, I don't also have to change it here and like change it again later. I've only got one place to store these kinds of things. All right, so from here then we're going to click a button that says log in. And then from here, we'll expect that our current path takes us back to our root path. And we'll expect that same welcome message that we saw before. So we'll expect page to content that says welcome with our string interpolation, double quotes. And here we'll just put our user.email again. V, you got a question? What's up?
I was just wondering if you intended to keep the attribute on line 6 as username instead of email.
Oh, thank you. Good catch. We do want that to be email. So we'll actually make that email. Yep, thank you for that. In this case, it wouldn't really matter because we're not actually validating that this thing actually is an email. We could, though, within the form, instead of making this a text field, we could actually say that this is an email field. And then the browser will actually do some level of validation for us and say, what you're typing in doesn't look like an email address. And so that would actually be a better form attribute to use instead of just text field. So that way our browser will do that for us. Cool. So I'll actually make that change and send that up. But that would be a good sad path that what they type in doesn't look like an email address. Cool. Did you have a follow-up question, V?
Oh, no, sorry. Just forgot to
Okay.
lower.
No worries. Just checking. Cool. So we got that test. Let's go run that test. Make sure that that's failing for all the right reasons. We never want to like write a test and then immediately start implementing our code. We want to make sure that our test is failing for the right reason. In this case, yeah, we don't have that link. So let's go build that on our welcome page. And we're just going to duplicate this line and say, what did I say? I have an account. And this is going to go to a login path. Is that what we called it? I have an account in our test. I have an account, yeah. Okay. So then back in RSpec. Now we got all kinds of failures. So now our first test is also failing because we're trying to build something on the page and it's causing, because that doesn't compile, we don't have a login path. Our first test is also failing because it's not rendering that page properly. So we need to go build that. Now this is where we're going to kind of divert a little bit in kind of what we've been teaching you about. Everything should be RESTful. In this case, nah, not everything has to be RESTful. In this case, logging in is not a RESTful thing because we're not creating a resource. We're not reading in a specific resource. We're not updating, deleting a resource. And so this is where it's okay to start building non-RESTful routing. And so we're going to make a path called login, and we're going to send that over to our users controller where we're going to build like a login form or something like that. So this is going to go to our users controller, and we're going to make a method over there called login form. So now the first test should pass, and now we're just our login test is failing. Alex, what do you got?
Is it common to do this as like a session instead of redirecting them to like the user's login?
Yes, but that's going to steal Tim's thunder if I get into sessions because Tim's going to teach you all about that tomorrow. So yes, for now,
hold
we're
your
going to.
horses.
Yeah, calm down. Jeez. No, Tim's going to refactor this code tomorrow and show you how to use sessions for this. We're not going to do any session management in this class. This is just showing you just the raw, like introductory, like let's get this stuff set up. But thank you for asking. Yes, typically that would be done in a session. Cool. So now we don't have that in our user controller. So let's go build that. Now, in this case, we don't have to do a user new because again, we're not creating a user. So we actually don't need anything in that method at this point. So now it should just complain about the form. Yeah, so we don't have a template. So we'll go build that under our users folder. We're gonna make a new file and we'll call it login form. And I'm actually gonna paste in the old form, but I'm gonna take some stuff out of here. I'm gonna change this up a little bit. So what I'm gonna do in here is I'm gonna give it a URL instead of a model. And we're gonna tell it that this is gonna post to our login path. So we're going to keep everything else exactly the same, except our button is going to say login. So we're still going to have an email, still going to have a password. We're going to keep that local true because we saw that that jumped up and bit us last time. So we want to make sure that that's in there as well. We'll run RSpec again. Let's see how far our test gets us now. Cool. So now we don't have the post for the form. So we'll go back to our route and we'll go add that as a route. So we're just going to make this a post, and this will just be like login instead of login form. And it'll go run that test again. And that's failing because we don't have that method in our user controller. So we'll go back over here and we'll make f login. Now it's expecting that redirect to happen again. So just like before, we want to redirect back to that root path. We know we also need this flash message as well. So I'm going to copy these down into here. But we actually need to go look up that user. So at this point, we need to actually go take a look at what they sent us and make sure that what they sent us is valid. In this case, we don't really want to reuse the user params because they're not saving something in the database. We're just looking something up in the database. So we don't have to use the strong params here. What we can do here is we can just say like user find by, and we can say we want to find by the email and we want this to come from params email. And we're going to try and look at that user. And here we'll just, instead of new user, we'll just say user.email. Come over here and run that again. And our test passes, we're all done, right? Right, our test pass, so that should work, right? What did I not do? Pack it up. Yep, let's pack it up, go home. Ryan, what do you got?
Well, I was just saying maybe manually test it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, we can manually test it. Sure. Let's go back over to our browser, go back to our welcome page. If we reload now, I have an account and I forget what I called it before. What was our old username? I don't remember.
Tim the Skier.
Tim the Skier, thank you.
I think.
Was it
email.
example or Gmail? Was it email.com?
Email.com.
Yeah, that worked. Okay, cool. Phew, I'm glad you remembered that. So Tim the Skier at email.com. And I'm just going to type in like tons of gibberish here as the password, and it still lets us log in because we're not actually checking the password here. So like Aiden mentioned in chat, we're not actually doing anything with the password. All we're doing is we're saying like, go get my user. But that's not enough. They gave us a password for a reason. We need to actually validate that they gave us the right password. So even though our test passed, again, doesn't mean that things worked, right? So now what we need to do is we're going to make a sad path test down here. So we're going to do sad path. And we're going to block the login if bad credentials. So we're going to have the same sort of setup here. We're going to make an email. We're going to put in a password. But what we're going to change in here is we're actually going to put in like bad password. And we're going to override that password with something that's not there. We're going to click the login. We're still going to expect that we get back to our root path. Actually, in this case, we want to stay on our login path. We want to go back to the login form, but now our flash message, we should see something like, your credentials are bad and you should feel bad. When we deal with credentials, we don't want to tell them which one was wrong. We don't want to tell them that their email was correct, but the password was wrong. And we don't want to tell them that the email was bad. We just want to say, like, the combination you gave us, I don't know what to do with that. That is the most secure kind of error message that we can send them back. It doesn't sound as user-friendly. Usually we want to be like really user-friendly, but in this case, we don't want to be user-friendly and tell them which one was bad. Because if they know they got the right email address, then they're going to keep brute forcing a password. And so this is one scenario where we want to be vague in our error message. So we're going to set that up as a sad path test. Let's go run that. Except this is going to fail because it thinks it should pass because we're not actually validating the password. We expected to stay on that login path, and it actually redirected us to our root path because it worked. So let's go take a look at what we need to do in here. Let's see, in our user controller, when we go look up that user, now what we want to do is we want to say, like, if we have that user, and bcrypt gives us a new method that we can use called authenticate. And what we can do here is we can pass in our password param. So if this worked, then we're going to redirect to our root path.
Ian, line 17, pasams is not params.
Yep, thank you. So this is where we could build an else and say, like, you know, if that didn't work, then say, sorry, your credentials are bad. What we see a lot of times is user will like build this out for the happy path test and then like forget to write the sad path test. And then their code coverage doesn't actually hit this else statement. And so I would say, like, always like build a happy path test, make the happy path code, build a sad path test. Now we're going to build our sad path code. So don't build this else until you have a test for it to begin with. I'm a big fan of TDD, and I'll go into why throughout the mod. So inside here, we'll set a flash of an error message. And this is where we'll set it to be like, your credentials are bad. And you should feel bad. And now, instead of redirecting them, we just want to re-render our login form template. And so what we're rendering here is saying, go find that login form.html.erb and just render that instead. Alex, you had a question. What's up?
Yeah, I might be skipping ahead, or maybe I'm got a gap in my understanding. But currently, with the way this authentication is set up, if we had, say, a viewing party page or whatever other resource, we don't actually have a way to stop somebody if they knew what was from visiting to do something elsewhere in our application to make sure that like a user is currently logged in if they try to skip ahead to any of those pages.
Yeah, and Tim will cover some of that in the session class tomorrow. Yep. Because yeah, we do want to check on certain pages that they are logged in. And so Tim will cover that tomorrow. And that'll be a line of code. Tim is going to add code right here. Tim, not time. Tim.
That's
capital
a nice
T.
reminder. I appreciate that comment.
No problem. I'll even mark it as a to-do for you. How's that? Yeah, so that's where Tim's going to add some code to like track that stuff in a session.
Also, just don't ever do this in production code.
Yeah. Actually, I will leave that in there for Tim. Cool. So let's go back and check our test again. All right, so now we're passing. So now we know that if we type in the wrong password, that this is going to work. Now, one thing that I mentioned at the beginning of the class is I was going to show you a best practice here. When we're creating our user and when we're looking up the user, we're expecting that the case sensitivity of the email matched exactly. In this case, even if I were to go back to that form and say I have an account and actually log in, but put in timtheskier@email.com, but change the case sensitivity of that email address, it would actually fail because right now it's doing a case sensitive match because of how we're doing this. And so a couple of things that we need to do here. Before we do the user create with our user params, this is a best practice that I would like you all to employ. We're going to go grab user from user params. And then we're going to do something like if the user has an email or something like that, in this case, we'll just assume that they have it because we built this out as happy path. But what we want to do is we want to say that the user email is going to be set to user email downcase. We want to make sure that whenever we take an email address from a user, that we always lowercase that email before we save it in the database. And then we want to do it again when we look it up. And so we want to force this to be a lowercase thing. Now, there is a thing that we can do at a model level that says, before we save something in the database, manipulate the data in some way. So we could just do that at a model level and say at a model level, just always force this field to be lowercase no matter what. Email addresses, always, 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 please lowercase those things, and do the same thing when you're looking it up. When you're doing a lookup, also lowercase it. Otherwise, the case sensitivity will be off. Cool. That will be an industry best practice that you should know. Let's go back, just make sure that based on those changes that I didn't break anything else. So go rerun all our tests. Everything's still passing. Because we happen to do everything with uppercase and lowercase. But one way that we could test this now is that we've made the email address with like fun bucket. Let's do capital F, capital B, and capital E on example. And what we can do here is we can actually say like, we'll leave the, actually, let's do, so we're storing it in the database as mixed case, but what we're actually going to fill in the form, we're going to lowercase. So this should test. If this test passes, then that's going to tell us that that we actually stored it properly in lowercase format, and that actually worked okay. Actually, in that case, it won't. I take that back. So this one will have to be fun bucket, all lowercase, and we will upcase here instead. So that will test that. But we should test in the registration form that we do that as lowercase. So let's just test this out here in our login test, that if we send everything in the email address as uppercase, that's still going to match okay. Oops. Yeah, that still worked. All right, cool. So just as an industry best practice, something to keep in mind there. So Alex mentioned in chat, push as much of the model as possible. Yeah, I agree. As much as possible, you want to try to let the models take care of that kind of stuff. For something like the lookup, though, we kind of have to do the down case here because this is going to happen at a controller level, but the down case here could absolutely happen at the model level. I'll leave it here for now. If you want to practice moving that stuff down to the model, that would be fine. Let's take any last questions that you got. I'd like to do like a 10-minute palm break. And then if y'all want, we can do the database class now as far as like what to model out, because there's some other things you may need to model out for the users. We want to talk about the modeling for the friends table, how you want to manage friends, and then like what data we need to store in the database for our movies. But I do want like a longer palm break in between. So if there are any last questions, I'll take those now, and then we'll do like a 15-minute palm break. Going once. Going twice. If you have other questions, feel free to parking lot them as well. Happy to take those there. Nothing else? All right. I'm going to get this code pushed up a little bit later. I'll get the recording pushed up later as well. If you want to go back and review anything. Cool. Thanks for hanging out. Let's come back at, we'll have a new Zoom link for this and we'll come back in 15 minutes. So we'll come back at like 11:05-ish. So we'll see you back then.